The room went dead silent. "Why don't you explain, with your associate degree, why you think you know better than Yale-trained neurologists?" That is what Dr. Marcus Whitfield said 47 minutes before 8-year-old Emma Hartwell opened her eyes for the first time in 6 months. The ICU at Seattle General in Philadelphia hummed with the mechanical rhythm of ventilators and cardiac monitors, fluorescent lights casting a green pall across linoleum floors that reeked of bleach and something else, the sharp metallic smell of blood that wouldn't wash away no matter how many times the housekeeping staff mopped. Katie Rodriguez moved through the pediatric wing like smoke, invisible in navy scrubs faded from 1,000 washings, her hands gentle as they repositioned Emma Hartwell's small body every 90 minutes on the clock. The child lay motionless in the pediatric ICU bed, her 8-year-old frame no larger than a doll, her chart stamped with phrases in red ink, persistent vegetative state. No reasonable hope of recovery. Recommend comfort care only. The repositioning protocol was not ordered by any attending physician. Katie performed it anyway. Colonel James Hartwell, United States Air Force, sat rigid in the corner chair beside his daughter's bedside, still wearing his dress blues from yesterday's Pentagon briefing, the fabric creased into sharp lines that matched the geometry of his jaw. His eyes were hollow, the specific kind of hollow that came from watching your child's future collapse in a school bus impact on Route 9 6 months ago, watching 4 different neurologists shake their heads, watching hope die and resurrect and die again with each scan result. He watched Katie work. He had stopped asking questions 3 weeks into Emma's hospitalization. Katie's fingers moved with mechanical precision, adjusting the child's head angle by 3 degrees. She was studying Emma's pupils, watching for changes in dilation that the monitors wouldn't catch. The subtle shift in her right eye was there, barely perceptible, the kind of neurological response that registered as nothing on any chart but meant everything to someone who had seen it before. Emma's neural pathways were waking up. Not much. Not enough to mention. But waking. She reached into her scrub pocket and her thumb found the challenge coin, that tarnished piece of metal from Baghdad, worn smooth from years of tracing its edges during the long hours when sleep was a luxury and vigilance was survival. The coin had been given to her by a master chief whose name she could no longer say out loud, whose unit no longer officially existed, whose death had been classified so thoroughly that his own mother received a folded flag and never learned the truth. She held the coin for 3 seconds, then tucked it back into the pocket where it pressed against her ribs like a heartbeat that wasn't her own. The tremor in her left hand returned. She flexed her fingers. The tremor subsided. By 7:30 in the morning, Dr. Marcus Whitfield arrived for grand rounds like a weather system moving through the hospital, his white coat monogrammed with his initials in burgundy thread, his shoes clicking authority against the tile floor with each stride. He brought with him for residents 2 attending physicians, and the particular kind of confidence that only came from 23 years of being the smartest person in every room he entered. His tie cost more than Katie's monthly rent. His watch was a Rolex that gleamed beneath the ICU lights like evidence of a life lived in the upper atmosphere of institutional power. He had no idea that the quiet night nurse moving Emma's chart out of his path had performed this same repositioning protocol on blast victims in forward surgical tents at FOB Shank, Loga Province, where 1 degree of pressure difference between the 7th cervical vertebra and the brainstem meant the difference between brain death and the possibility of recovery. He had no idea that the hands now adjusting the pediatric ventilator had once performed direct cardiac massage through an open chest cavity while a surgeon worked against a 3-minute window and mortar fire hammered the tent walls like angry fists. "Let's review the Hartwell case," Whitfield said, his voice carrying across the ICU with the timbre of someone accustomed to being heard without having to raise his volume. The residents gathered around Emma's bedside like sharks circling. Whitfield picked up Katie's nursing notes with 2 fingers as if the paper itself might be contaminated, holding them at arm's length. He scanned them with the expression of someone reading graffiti in a bathroom stall. 90-minute repositioning intervals, he said, his eyes sweeping to Katie. "Which protocol ordered this?" Katie continued charting at the computer terminal. She did not look up. "None of the attending physicians ordered this," Whitfield continued, his voice now performing for the residents who were scribbling notes with the obedience of disciples. "This is an example of scope creep. Nursing staff overstepping licensure boundaries based on He paused, letting the silence extend like a rope being tied around her neck. Based on what exactly? Intuition. The resident smiled the way predators smile before the meal arrives. Katie's jaw tightened imperceptibly. Her hands remained steady on the keyboard. She continued charting. Her fingers moved through the protocol, timestamps, vital signs, pupil responsiveness, skin perfusion. The words flowed from her hands without her mind being present for them because her mind had learned long ago how to compartmentalize. Some part of her was still in the ICU in Philadelphia. Another part was still in Baghdad. The two existed simultaneously, and she had built a wall between them that was only permeable one direction, outward. Katie performs that protocol on all her pediatric patients. Colonel Hartwell's voice came from the corner, quiet but with the weight of command underneath it. She's the only reason my daughter is still here. Whitfield turned to him with the smile of someone who had learned that grief made people say things that could be exploited. Colonel, I understand the emotional difficulty of your situation. That does not change the fact that unlicensed interventions, no matter how well-intentioned, represent a liability exposure to this institution. Two residents snickered by the vending machines at the end of the hallway. Katie heard them clearly. Playing doctor. That was what one of them said. The other laughed. The laughter carried further than they intended, reaching across the open architecture of the ICU ward, finding its target with the precision of a laser sight. Katie continued charting. Security escorts are standard procedure for staff who cannot recognize their limitations, Whitfield announced, his eyes on Katie now, waiting for a reaction. He waited. No reaction came. Katie typed. The fluorescent lights hummed above them, a sound like the rotor wash of a Black Hawk hovering 1,000 feet up, and she focused on that sound because it was real and it was familiar and it meant something to her that nothing else in this hospital meant. Whitfield held the silence for 4 more seconds, watching her not break, watching her not flinch, watching her remain exactly where she was in that terrible calm that comes from having already survived the worst. Then he turned back to the residents. Let's move on. Next case. The group flowed out of the pediatric ICU like water finding the path of least resistance, Whitfield's voice already pivoting to another patient, another opportunity to demonstrate his intellectual superiority, another chance to reinforce the hierarchy that kept him at the top and everyone else in their assigned places. The residents followed. Colonel Hartwell remained sitting in his corner chair, his jaw working as if he wanted to say something but had learned that words were sometimes the least effective tool available. Katie finished her charting at 8:42. She clocked out at 9 o'clock. She drove home in silence because the radio in her 2003 Honda Civic had stopped working 3 years ago and she had never bothered to fix it. She lived in a studio apartment on South Street, 4th floor of a converted textile mill, and when she unlocked her door she was greeted by the smell of her own solitude, coffee that had gone cold on the counter, the faint chemical tang of the fabric softener she used on her scrubs, and underneath it all, something that never quite went away no matter how much she cleaned, the memory of other places. She sat on the edge of her bed at 11:36 p.m. and pulled the tarnished challenge coin from her pocket. The coin was bronze, or had been once. Now it was the color of old blood. On one side, a unit insignia that no longer existed in any official military records. On the other side, a date. December 14, 2004. The date was wrong. The actual date was December 15th, but Master Chief Ramirez had made the mistake engraving it, and Katie had kept the coin anyway because mistakes made things real in a way that perfection never could. She turned it over and over, her thumb tracing the worn edges where thousands of other thumbs had traced before hers, going back decades, back to the men who had carried it through operations she would never know the full names of, through moments classified so thoroughly that the true history of events would die with the people who lived them. She thought about Emma Hartwell, about that slight change in pupil dilation that meant something was shifting in the girl's brain, neurons firing in patterns that suggested consciousness trying to claw its way back up from the deep. She thought about Whitfield's voice asking her to explain with her associate degree. The associate's degree was real. It was from a community college in San Antonio, Texas, and she had paid for it with money from her nursing signing bonus, the same signing bonus that had helped her vanish into civilian life 3 years ago when the operation in Syria went catastrophically wrong. Master Chief Petty Officer Katie Rodriguez had been officially declared killed in action along with 11 other operatives. Officially, she no longer existed. Unofficially, she was in Philadelphia watching an 8-year-old child slowly remember how to be alive. She turned the coin one more time. Then she tucked it back into the drawer beneath her bed, between old photographs she never looked at and letters she had never opened. By midnight, she was asleep. But Emma Hartwell's pupils, when Katie's replacement night nurse checked them at 2:15 a.m., had dilated by a full millimeter in response to light stimulus. The pupils didn't lie. By 3 in the morning, Emma Hartwell's left eye had dilated to 7 millimeters while the right remained pinpoint, and Katie knew what that meant without checking the intracranial pressure monitor. Herniation. The child's brain was swelling into spaces it shouldn't occupy, pressing downward through the foramen magnum, crushing the brainstem into shutdown. Katie was repositioning Emma's head, elevating it 30 degrees to reduce venous congestion, when she felt the subtle resistance change in the child's body that meant everything had shifted. The night was so quiet you could hear the ventilator's mechanical breath, steady and oblivious to the disaster unfolding beneath Emma's skull. Katie pressed the code button at 2:24 a.m. The sound it made was a tone that traveled through every speaker in Seattle General's neurosurgery wing, a low electronic wail that turned sleeping staff into running staff. The night resident, a third-year named Patterson who had been studying at the nurse's station, appeared in the doorway looking the way people look when they've just learned their worst fear is actually happening. "She's herniating," Katie said. "Not a question. Not a request. I need Manitou, I need the neuro team, I need them in 90 seconds or we lose her." Patterson's mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. Katie was already moving. She lowered the head of the bed and grabbed the ambu bag, her hands fitting over the mask with the same precision that had once sealed a combat helmet in zero-visibility dust. Squeeze, release, squeeze, release. Hyperventilation. Push the CO2 out, constrict the blood vessels, buy time. The monitor showed Emma's heart rate dropping. 42. 40. 38. The bradycardia was coming, the signature rhythm of a brainstem being strangled from above. "Where's that Manitou?" Katie's voice didn't rise. Raised voices were for people who hadn't trained under fire. Raised voices panicked rooms. Patterson was already moving, calling down to pharmacy, his hand shaking as he pulled the 4-line check. Katie didn't watch him. Katie watched the monitor. The pressure reading climbed like a countdown timer nobody wanted to see. 45. 46. Emma's O2 sat held steady at 94, but it was dropping. The child was dying inside her own skull, and every second Katie delayed was a neuron that wouldn't wake up. The Manitou came. Patterson pushed it. The pressure monitor didn't change. 30 seconds went past. The monitor showed no improvement. Emma's heart rate was now 35 and dropping. That was the sound of a child losing consciousness at the cellular level, oxygen-starved neurons dying in cascades. Katie made the decision that would either save Emma Hartwell's life or end her own career in a termination meeting with hospital security and a legal liability statement nobody would let her refute. She stripped off her current gloves and snapped new ones on with a crack like a gunshot in the silent room. "Surgical kit," she said. "Betadine. Chest tray. Now." "What are you?" Patterson started. "I said now." There was something in her voice that made him run. The pitch dropped. The tone became something that had nothing to do with emergency protocols or hospital hierarchy. It was the voice of someone accustomed to being obeyed in places where hesitation meant body bags. Patterson returned with the tray in 45 seconds. Katie prepped Emma's anterior chest with betadine in broad, efficient strokes that turned the pale skin copper gold. The smell of antiseptic hung in the air like an incantation. She made a single vertical incision through skin and muscle and fascia, and spread the ribs with a retractor in movements so practiced they looked choreographed by something older than doubt. The pericardium opened. Emma's small heart lay exposed, looking the color of raw liver, beating so slowly it seemed to hesitate between each contraction. Katie placed her fingers against it. Index and middle finger, third finger for support. She began direct cardiac massage, compress, compress, release, 3-count rhythm that she had learned in a tent hospital outside Baghdad when the power went out during a mass casualty event and a child with abdominal trauma was going into arrest. That child had lived. This one would too. 90 seconds. The monitor showed a change. The rhythm caught. Held. Emma's heart found its own beat and began pulling itself forward without Katie's hands guiding it. The O2 sat climbed to 96. The heart rate came up to 70. The intracranial pressure, impossibly, began to drop. Dr. Sarah Chen, the anesthesiologist, stood in the doorway frozen in a way that had nothing to do with shock and everything to do with recognition. Chen was a former Army combat medic with 3 deployment patches and a scar across her left ear from shrapnel at Kandahar Air Base. She knew the 3-point Kandahar technique because she had trained people to perform it in field hospitals where surgeons worked by flashlight and morphine came in 2-milliliter syringes you counted like ammunition. That technique had not been used in a civilian hospital in the continental United States in 15 years. Katie finished closing the pericardium with sutures that were almost delicate, placed with the care of someone who understood that even in extremis, precision mattered. She documented the procedure in calm, clinical language, code called at 2:53 a.m., progressive intracranial herniation with bradycardic arrest, emergency open chest direct cardiac massage initiated, ROSC achieved at 3:32 a.m. Return of spontaneous circulation. The clinical term for a miracle that fit inside 90 seconds. She stripped off her gloves. They made a sound like a window closing. "Where did you learn to do that?" Chen asked quietly. Her voice was steady but her eyes were moving, taking inventory, cataloging details the way someone catalogs evidence. Katie turned. For a moment she was somewhere else. Maybe a sandstorm in Baghdad where the wind moved like something alive and dust got into everything, weapons, wounds, prayers. Maybe in a shot-up Humvee in Sadr City where a man had been bleeding out and there was no surgical team and only her hands and 7 minutes before cellular death became permanent death. She came back to the Philadelphia night and a child who was alive and a doctor who had just recognized a technique that was supposed to have been buried deeper than classified. YouTube, Katie said flatly. She dropped the gloves into the biohazard bin and walked out of the room without waiting for a follow-up question. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Dr. Sarah Chen didn't believe her for a second. The worst part was that Katie's hands, as she walked down the hallway to document the emergency procedure in the computer system, were moving with the kind of muscle memory that couldn't be learned from a video. The worst part was that by the time the sun came up over Philadelphia, at least 4 people would know that the timid nurse who accepted insults without comment had just performed a surgical procedure that belonged in a military combat manual, not in a civilian CT suite at 3:15 in the morning. And the moment someone else found out, everything would collapse. The careful invisibility. The 2 years of keeping her head down. The apartment with the door that locked. The false name and the false resume and the challenge coin she kept in the dark and turned over in her fingers like prayer beads when the nightmares came. Katie sat down at the nurse's station at 3:38 a.m. and began filling out the proper paperwork, her hand steady as surgical lasers, her face showing nothing at all. The resident's voice crackled over the phone at 4:15 a.m., panic threaded through each word. "Dr. Whitfield, you need to come in. Now." Emma Hartwell coded 20 minutes ago and the nurse, but Whitfield was already moving, already pulling on his jacket, already calculating the career trajectory that hinged on the next 4 hours. He'd been asleep when the call came. His penthouse in Rittenhouse Square overlooking the city lights. His wife in the guest bedroom. His ambitions perfectly positioned for the board seat that was supposed to be his by summer. He drove the empty streets of Philadelphia at 6 in the morning like a man going to war, his jaw tight, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. Seattle General's fluorescent lights made everything look temporary, disposable. Whitfield took the stairs instead of the elevator, faster, more dramatic, the kind of entrance that residents noticed. Emma's room was on the 4th floor, and Colonel Hartwell was standing outside the glass partition, his uniform still crisp despite the 4 a.m. crisis, his face the color of old concrete. Whitfield pushed past him without acknowledging him and froze when he saw Emma's chart. Intracranial pressure, 18 millimeters of mercury. Normal. The numbers shouldn't have been normal. The child had suffered catastrophic brain damage. Every neurologist at Johns Hopkins had said her intracranial pressure would climb until her brainstem herniated and she died. But the numbers were normal. And there, documented in obsessive detail in the nursing notes, was Katie Rodriguez's handwriting. For 07 a.m., emergency decompressive procedure initiated. For 09 a.m., direct cardiac massage via thoracotomy. For 11 a.m., sinus rhythm restored. For 13 a.m., EICP stabilized at 21. For 15 a.m., vitals sustained. No physician signature. No authorization. Just a nurse's careful notation of a surgical procedure that had taken 4 minutes and saved the child's life and ended Whitfield's board appointment before it ever began. His hand started to shake. Not from relief. From something else. Something that tasted like burning metal and sounded like a door slamming shut on a future he'd already begun living in his head. Katie was at the nurse's station when he found her 20 minutes later, finishing her charting, her scrub still damp from the resuscitation, her face showing nothing. The kind of composure that made other nurses uncomfortable. The kind of calm that suggested she'd done worse things in worse places than save an 8-year-old girl on a Tuesday morning in Philadelphia. "My office," Whitfield said. Not a request. Not a suggestion. Now. The conference room on the 3rd floor was designed for teaching rounds, stainless steel table, mounted displays for x-rays, windows overlooking the parking lot where the early shift was beginning to arrive in their sensible cars in their sensible clothes. Whitfield closed the door and stood with his back to it, a man blocking an exit. "Do you have any comprehension of what you've done?" His voice was low, controlled, the voice of someone who had practiced this conversation in the shower and in traffic and in the dark where his wife couldn't hear him. "You performed surgery without a physician present. You performed surgery without authorization. You violated every protocol we have. This hospital could lose its accreditation." Katie stood with her arms at her sides, her shoulders relaxed, her breathing steady. She'd heard worse from drill instructors. She'd heard worse from men trying to kill her. "The child is alive," Katie said. "The child is alive because you got lucky," Whitfield snapped. "And now I have to clean up your mess. Do you understand the liability exposure? The lawsuit probability? Do you have any idea what the state medical board is going to do when they find out that a nurse with an associate degree decided to perform open-chest cardiac massage without supervision?" She flatlined, Katie said. Her voice was flat as a map. No heartbeat. No oxygen. The only choice was let her die or save her. "I saved her." Whitfield's face went the color of old paper. "There are protocols for a reason. There are physicians on call for a reason. You just handed me a legal nightmare, and I need you to understand that this is finished. You're finished." He pulled out his phone, and Katie watched his thumb move across the screen with the precision of someone making decisions that would burn bridges and end careers and alter the trajectory of multiple lives simultaneously. He turned toward the window, toward the Philadelphia skyline where the sun was beginning to stain the sky orange and gold, and began to make calls. The first call was to Dr. Raymond Chen, his mentor, the man who'd written the recommendation letter that got Whitfield into Yale Medical School back when he was still hungry and still believable. 47 minutes on the phone. Whitfield's voice never raised. He presented the facts like a prosecutor: unauthorized procedure, no supervision, scope violation, liability exposure, pattern of unsupervised intervention. By the end of the call, Dr. Chen had agreed to expedite a license investigation through the state medical board. Whitfield hung up with the satisfaction of a man who'd just called in an airstrike on his own position because he knew it would take out the enemy first. The second call was to legal. Rebecca Marks, the hospital's chief counsel, arrived at 7:32 a.m. with her legal pad and her reading glasses and her expression of practiced concern. Whitfield spread Emma's chart across the conference table like a prosecutor laying out evidence. Every notation from Katie. Every decision made without physician presence. Every deviation from protocol. He highlighted passages with his finger while Rebecca took notes with the methodical precision of someone building a case that would hold up in court. The liability is enormous, Rebecca said. If there's any complication, any permanent damage, the parents could argue that Katie's unsupervised intervention caused injury. We're looking at 7 figures in exposure. Possibly 8. Then we build a systematic case, Whitfield said. He was thinking out loud now, his voice moving with the smooth precision of a chess player who could see 6 moves ahead. We bring in a consultant. Outside eyes. Independent review. We establish a pattern of scope violation. We document everything. We protect the hospital by removing the threat. The consultant arrived at 10:02 a.m. Dr. Malcolm Harrison from Johns Hopkins, expensive suit, the kind of credibility that cost $5,000 a day plus expenses. Whitfield gave him access to every chart Katie had touched in the past 6 months. 53 patient files. 62 individual interventions. Harrison's task was simple: find where Katie had exceeded her scope of practice. Document it. Create a paper trail that would survive legal review. By noon, the case was built. Not with lies. With facts arranged in such a way that they told a story of a nurse who had systematically overstepped her authority, who had repeatedly made decisions that should have been made by physicians, who represented a liability and a regulatory nightmare and a threat to institutional integrity. At 1:15 p.m., Katie was called to Human Resources on the 2nd floor, a department that existed in a beige corporate purgatory where women with kind eyes and laminated scripts delivered terminations with the flat efficiency of flight attendants explaining safety procedures. The woman's name was Margaret. She had 3 photographs on her desk, 2 children in Little League uniforms and a golden retriever in a bandana. Katie, we're going to place you on immediate administrative leave, effective now, pending a full investigation into potential scope of practice violations. Margaret's voice was gentle, which somehow made it worse. Security will escort you to collect your personal belongings. Your badge is being deactivated. You're not to contact any hospital employees or any patients regarding this matter. Do you understand? Katie nodded. She understood perfectly. She understood that she'd broken protocol to save a child's life and that she was about to be destroyed for it by a man whose entire career was built on understanding how institutions protected themselves. Security arrived 5 minutes later. 2 men in navy uniforms with radios and purposeful expressions. They walked her to her locker on the 4th floor while the day shift nurses watched from the station, their faces carefully neutral, the way people's faces get when they're witnessing something they're afraid might be contagious. Katie opened her locker. The challenge coin, smooth from 18 years of her thumb running across its edges. A photograph from her Navy boot camp graduation, her smile looking like someone else's face. A protein bar from the dollar store. A name tag that said Katie Rodriguez, RN, Seattle General, and underneath, Compassionate Care. She put everything in a paper bag. The bag was white, the kind that made everything inside look temporary and forgettable. She didn't look at the nurses. She didn't acknowledge their sympathy or their fear. She just walked past the station and toward the stairs, her shoes making no sound at all on the linoleum, her movements fluid and efficient and carrying the particular grace of someone who'd learned a long time ago how to leave rooms without being remembered. Whitfield watched her from the 3rd floor window, phone pressed to his ear, already making another call. Already moving on to the next thing. Already congratulating himself on removing a threat before it could metastasize into something that might actually cost him something that mattered. What he didn't know was what Katie Rodriguez carried inside that white paper bag. What he didn't know was that some threats don't disappear just because you've built a case against them. Some threats just go quiet. Some threats just get patient. Katie sat in the corner booth of Mel's Diner on South Street, the same booth where the red vinyl cracked and peeled like sunburned skin. It was 3 in the morning. The fluorescent lights hummed their electric prayer above her head, and she was the only customer. The waitress, a woman named Carol with 30 years written in the lines around her eyes, had stopped asking if she wanted anything else around 2:33 a.m. Now Carol just refilled the coffee without speaking, understanding that some people came to diners not for the food but for the permission to sit still. Katie's coffee had gone cold an hour ago. She hadn't touched it. Her eyes tracked the reflection in the dark window across from her booth, a woman in scrubs staring back at herself like a stranger. Pale. Thin. The kind of hollow that comes from running on fumes for 3 days straight. She turned the tarnished challenge coin over in her fingers, feeling the grooves worn smooth from 3 years of nervous handling in parking lots and break rooms and the bathroom stall at Seattle General where she had learned to cry without making a sound. The coin had her unit insignia stamped on one side, a ghost superimposed over crossed swords. White Ghost. That was what they called her in Sadra City, in the FOB briefings, in the combat after-action reports that no longer existed because she no longer existed. 3 years ago, a black site operation in Syria went catastrophically wrong. The safe house was compromised. 12 operators were declared killed in action. The mission was buried so deep that even the families of the dead received caskets filled with nothing but flags and official lies. Master Chief Petty Officer Catherine Maria Rodriguez held that safe house alone for 46 hours against forces that didn't have a name on any Pentagon manifest. She was extracted bleeding, half-conscious, with shrapnel patterns across her forearms that looked like a map of places that were erased from history. The Navy gave her a choice that wasn't a choice at all. Her service record was classified. Her Medal of Honor recommendation was sealed under protection levels that required 3 generals to access. Her name was removed from every database, every roster, every official registry. They gave her a new social security number. A fabricated employment history. A nursing degree from a school that kept records that would withstand a background check. And they gave her an order: disappear into civilian life because officially, Master Chief Petty Officer Katie Rodriguez no longer exists. For 3 years, she had managed it. Night shifts. No friends. A studio apartment where she paid rent in cash. A job at Seattle General where she kept her head so far down that some days she wondered if anyone could actually see her or if she had become the ghost they said she was. She was invisible. Invisible was safe. Invisible was the deal she had made. Then Emma Hartwell stopped breathing. Then every neurologist in Philadelphia gave up. Then Katie's hands remembered things her mind wasn't supposed to know, and she pulled a child back from the edge of death using techniques that only forward surgical teams used in active combat zones. And Dr. Sarah Chen recognized those techniques. And everything collapsed. Katie's phone had buzzed at 1:15 a.m. with a suspension notice. Official termination would follow pending investigation. Dr. Whitfield had called the state medical board. He had engaged hospital legal counsel. He had weaponized every protocol, every policy, every institutional rule to bury her. Katie had watched her locker being emptied by 2 security guards while the day shift nurses pretended not to see. She had signed termination paperwork without reading it. She had asked no questions. She had mounted no defense because she couldn't. 3 years ago, at a secure facility in Northern Virginia, she had been given explicit written orders: if your cover is ever blown, you do not defend yourself. You do not explain. You do not fight back in any institutional context. You disappear. That was the protocol. That was the agreement. She wondered if saving one child was worth losing the only identity she had left. Not the identity of Master Chief Petty Officer. That identity had already been buried in Syria. She had lost at the moment the safe house was breached. But this identity, Katie Rodriguez, night shift nurse, invisible woman who no one remembered, the half-life that she had constructed from scratch over 36 months, that identity was solid. That identity had paperwork. That identity could sit in a diner drinking cold coffee without the Pentagon noticing. Now she had nothing. No hospital badge. No staff ID. No employment history that checked out. Just a woman in scrubs holding a coin that shouldn't exist, sitting in a diner at 3 in the morning, staring at her own reflection and trying to calculate what the exchange rate was between saving one child and losing the ground beneath her feet. The coffee was cold. The coin was warm from her hand. Carol had given up trying to refill the cup. Outside, Philadelphia slept the way cities sleep, with the sound of distant sirens and the hiss of rain on hot asphalt and the weight of 3 million people trying not to think about their own invisible struggles. At 6:23 a.m., Dr. Sarah Chen sat at a desk in a darkened office with a laptop and 3 years of Katie's employment records spread in front of her. Chen was a former Army combat medic who had spent 7 years in forward surgical teams, and she recognized what other people missed. The precision. The muscle memory. The way Katie's hands moved when a crisis hit, like someone operating on instinct forged in places where hesitation meant death. Chen had watched Katie perform that open-chest cardiac massage on Emma, watched the way her fingers found exactly the right pressure points, watched the way her eyes didn't blink once during the procedure. That was Kandahar technique. That was special operations. That was someone who had trained for situations that didn't exist in civilian hospital protocols. Chen started digging. She called contacts she hadn't spoken to in 5 years, intel officers, people from her own unit who had transitioned to private security, a psychiatrist who worked with special operations personnel. She sent encrypted messages. She asked careful questions. By 7:22 a.m., she had a working theory. By 8:15 a.m., she had called a journalist named Rebecca Strand at Reuters, someone who had covered Katie's suspension in a small column about hospital staff disputes. Strand was interested. Strand started pulling threads. On day 6, while Katie sat in her apartment staring at the walls, while Colonel Hartwell made phone calls to the Pentagon, while Dr. Whitfield consolidated his institutional power and congratulated himself on eliminating the threat to his authority, Rebecca Strand published a story that began with a simple headline: "Miraculous Recovery Raises Questions About Suspended Nurses' Credentials." The story was small. 3 paragraphs. But Strand had done her research. She had noted the unusual precision of Katie's medical interventions. She had interviewed anonymous residents who spoke of techniques they had never seen in training. She had asked uncomfortable questions about why a nurse with such apparent competence would be suspended for saving a patient's life. The story landed wrong. It landed in the spaces between institutional power and public trust. It made Seattle General look culpable. It made Dr. Whitfield look desperate and political. It made people wonder what they were hiding, which is always a more dangerous question than knowing the truth. But that wasn't the worst part. That wasn't the thing that changed everything. On day 6 at 11:44 p.m., a man was wheeled into Seattle General's emergency department with a gunshot wound to the femoral artery, bleeding out with the kind of velocity that suggested 40 minutes maximum before cardiac arrest. The trauma team assembled. The attending physician ordered blood products. The nurses positioned monitoring equipment. The room moved with the practiced choreography of people trained in organized chaos. Katie had come to the hospital to collect her final paycheck from the HR office. She was leaving when the trauma alert sounded. She stood in the corridor for 3 seconds, listening to the organized storm behind those ER doors. Then muscle memory overrode everything else. She moved. She was pressing both hands into a groin wound when the man's eyes opened and locked directly on her face. He was Middle Eastern, maybe 50, with grey threading his beard like silver wire. His eyes widened with something that looked like impossible recognition. "White ghost," he whispered in perfect English. His voice was loud enough that 3 nurses heard it. His hand came up and gripped her wrist with surprising strength. "Cedra City. The Humvee. You pulled me out." The ER went silent. Not quiet. Silent. The kind of silence where the ventilator sounds like an accusation and the heart monitor becomes the only voice in the world. "Cedra City, 2008, the man continued, his voice stronger now, holding onto her arm like she might vanish. 3 blocks under sniper fire. They said you died. They said White Ghost was killed in Syria. Someone's pager beeped. No one moved to check it. Someone's pager beeped. No one moved to check it. The ER froze. A man lay on the trauma gurney, blood darkening the white sheet beneath him, his hand gripping the wrist of the nurse applying pressure to his femoral artery. The nurse's name tag read Rodriguez. Her hands didn't shake. Her breathing stayed level. The pressure remained constant, firm, methodical, the way you apply force when you've done it 1,000 times before and one more time is just routine. Farid al-Rashid looked up through the pain. His eyes found her face. He was maybe 50, with scars crossing his left temple and a jaw that had been reset badly at least once. Iraqi. Former intelligence officer, according to the intake paperwork that was already making its way through the hospital system. Gunshot wound to the femoral artery. 2 liters of blood loss. ETA for surgical team, 8 minutes. His mouth moved. The words came out in perfect English, rough with shock but clear as crystal. White Ghost. The monitor beeped once. Nobody else heard it. Katie didn't break eye contact. Didn't pull her hand back. Didn't acknowledge that a dead woman just walked into the ER with Iraqi blood on her scrubs. The pressure continued. Steady. Professional. A nurse doing her job. But Farid al-Rashid knew better. He had been pulled from a burning Humvee during the Battle of Sadr City 9 years ago, his uniform smoking, his radio shattered, 3 rounds in his chest and a 4th lodged in his leg. An American operative had moved through the smoke like something that wasn't bound by normal physics, pulled him out, packed his wounds with gauze that stung like fire, and left him at a forward surgical team with nothing but a call sign whispered in Arabic. White Ghost. El-Shabar al-Abayad. The operative was supposed to have died in Syria 3 years later. Officially, she was dead. But dead women don't apply pressure to femoral arteries. Dead women don't save children from intracranial herniation. Dead women don't stand in emergency rooms in Philadelphia looking like they've learned how to exist between the spaces where bureaucracy can't reach them. Marcus Webb stepped forward. He was the hospital's chief of security, 6'3" with the bearing of someone who had worn a uniform for 32 years and never quite took it off. He looked at Farid, then at Katie, then back at Farid with the expression of a man who had just watched his entire understanding of a situation reorganize itself in real time. That's Master Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez, son, Marcus said quietly. The voice was like a tank idling in a garage, something with immense power being held in careful restraint. And you will address her by rank. The room didn't go silent. The beeping continued. The ventilators hissed. The 4 pumps beeped their rhythmic warnings. But something in the air shifted. A weight settled. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like they were trying to process what they had just witnessed. Katie never looked away from the monitor. Her hands never wavered. But something in her shoulders changed, some invisible armor clicking into place, visible only to those who knew how to read the language of people who had operated in sandstorms with mortars overhead. The surgical team arrived 7 minutes later. They found a nurse whose hands were steady enough to pass instruments in a combat zone, whose knowledge of wound management made residents take notes, whose presence in the ER had somehow transformed the entire dynamic of the trauma bay from panic to precision. By the time they wheeled Farid upstairs to surgery, the blood loss had been controlled, the vital signs stabilized, and the narrative of Katie Rodriguez's life had fractured like old concrete. Within an hour, Colonel James Hartwell was standing in the hospital administrator's office, reading a document that required 3 different levels of Pentagon clearance just to open. His hands were shaking. He had read Katie's service record before, once, briefly, when she had come into Emma's room and saved his daughter's life. But reading it again, with the context of the past 6 months recontextualizing everything, the words seemed to be written in a language he was learning for the first time. 14 combat deployments. 3 theaters of operation. 2 Medal of Honor recommendations submitted through classified channels, both sealed to protect her operational cover. Bronze Star. Silver Star. 2 Purple Hearts. A Navy Cross. Distinguished Service Medal. A commendation citation that had been redacted so heavily it was mostly black ink and empty space. The document was thin. Katie Rodriguez's actual service record, the classified version, was apparently much longer. This was the version they could show him. The version that was allowed to exist in an office in Philadelphia with fluorescent lights and a hospital administrator who looked like he was trying to calculate how much legal liability he was responsible for. 3 hours later, the hospital boardroom was packed. Board members, administrators, the state medical board representative who had driven in from Harrisburg, hospital legal counsel, and a growing crowd of nurses and residents who had heard something was happening and needed to understand what. The investigation into Katie's suspension had become a news cycle. The Reuters article was spreading. An Iraqi man had recognized her from a war that was supposed to be forgotten. Emma Hartwell sat in a wheelchair at the front of the room. She was still small, still fragile in a way that broke your heart if you looked too closely, but she was awake. She was here. She was speaking. Katie sat with me every night, Emma said, her voice halting, the words coming slowly because her neural pathways were still rebuilding themselves. When the doctors said I wouldn't wake up. When my dad cried. When everybody said there was nothing left. She paused, gathering breath. She sang to me. Spanish songs. My abuela sang the same ones. Katie said she remembered them. From a place far away. She never stopped believing I could hear her. The room held the silence of people processing something that didn't fit into their understanding of institutional hierarchy. Emma was supposed to be comatose. The doctors had been clear. The neurologists had said the damage was irreversible. But here she was, speaking in sentences, asking for water, clutching the tarnished challenge coin that Katie had finally given her 3 days ago. Colonel Hartwell stood up. This woman saved my daughter's life twice. Once in the CT suite when everyone else was following protocol. And once every night in the darkness when she didn't have to be here, didn't have any obligation to be here, but she came anyway because she understood something about hope that most of us never will. The board member from Harrisburg looked uncomfortable. That's admirable, Colonel, but the investigation into Dr. Whitfield's conduct is a separate matter. We have documented evidence of scope violations and you have documented evidence of a nurse who performed an emergency procedure that saved a child's life, the board member interrupted. It was Sarah Chen. She had walked into the boardroom 5 minutes earlier with a folder that contained something nobody had expected. And you have documented evidence that Dr. Whitfield performed 18 unnecessary surgeries in the past 14 months. Procedures that were billed at an average of $47,000 per case. Surgeries that many of these patients, she pulled out affidavits, were told were the only option available. The next voice belonged to the outside consultant. The one Whitfield had hired to destroy Katie. He had found something else instead. He had found a pattern so clear, so damning, that he had felt professionally obligated to report it to the state board the moment he recognized it. His sworn statement was now part of the public record. Over the next 72 hours, the structure of Dr. Marcus Whitfield's life collapsed with the inevitability of a building that was structurally unsound from the foundation. The state medical board suspended his license pending investigation. The hospital placed him on administrative leave. 12 families filed coordinated malpractice claims. His mentor stopped returning his calls. The board seat he had been promised was given to Dr. Chen instead. His wife moved out, taking their 2 daughters to her sister's house in New Jersey with a suitcase and a grimness that suggested she had been planning this departure for longer than anyone realized. On the 4th day of his suspension, Whitfield sat alone in the hospital cafeteria at a corner table no one used anymore. He was picking at a salad he had no appetite to eat when Katie walked past carrying a tray. She didn't look at him. Didn't acknowledge his existence. Didn't slow her pace or show any recognition that the man who had spent 6 months trying to destroy her was sitting 3 tables away. She just kept walking. Perfectly calm. perfectly composed. The same expression she had worn when he was humiliating her in front of his residence, when he was calling security to escort her from the building, when he was calling the state board to accuse her of criminal negligence. That's when Whitfield understood. She had never been fighting him. She had never seen him as the threat. She had been saving a child, and his destruction was simply the natural consequence of his own actions circling back. 6 months later, Katie was walking past a strip mall in South Philadelphia when she saw the banner. It hung above a folding table on the sidewalk, white cloth printed with blue letters, Whitfield Insurance Services, Independent Agent, Life, Auto, Home. Dr. Marcus Whitfield sat behind the table in a rumpled polo shirt that didn't fit quite right anymore. He had lost weight. His face had the hollowed-out quality of someone who had stopped taking care of himself months ago. Insurance brochures were spread in front of him like a hand of cards nobody wanted to play. He tried to make eye contact with passing pedestrians. Nobody stopped. Nobody slowed down. Katie walked past without breaking stride. Her face showed nothing. The tarnished challenge coin from Baghdad was no longer in her pocket, it was in Emma's pocket now, the engraving worn smooth by an 8-year-old's nervous hands during physical therapy. Katie carried something else instead. A new coin, freshly minted, with Emma's initials engraved on the back. The weight of it in her pocket was different. It was heavier, somehow. Like it meant something more. 3 months later, Katie stood in Emma's hospital room, watching the 8-year-old work through physical therapy with a specialist. The girl's recovery was measured in increments that barely registered unless you were there every day to see them. But they registered. Her speech got stronger. Her legs got steadier. The neurologists who had declared her a lost cause were writing journal articles about unprecedented neuroplasticity following experimental repositioning protocols. Colonel Hartwell had offered to petition the Navy to reinstate her records officially. To restore her rank, give her back the identity that was erased in Syria, make her legally alive again in the eyes of the Department of Defense. Katie had declined. That person died in Syria, she had told him quietly, her voice the color of worn leather. Let her stay dead. I'm someone else now. But she had accepted the job offer from Seattle General's new director, a permanent position as clinical educator, teaching surgical nurses and residents the kind of field medicine that actually saves lives when everything goes wrong. Dr. Chen was now head of the emergency department and greeted Katie every morning with coffee and the kind of quiet respect that only veterans show each other. Marcus Webb got promoted to chief of security. Emma's room was no longer a temporary stop on a recovery arc that most people didn't believe in. It was becoming a home. The Philadelphia skyline glowed orange in the setting sun, visible through the window that looked west toward the city. Katie thought about the 12 operators who died in Syria, the ones whose names are carved on a memorial wall in a building she'll never be allowed to visit. She thought about the choice she had made 6 months ago to save one child even though it meant surfacing, risking everything, becoming visible again. In the hallway, a resident, one of the ones who had mocked her by the vending machines during rounds, stopped her nervously. Master Chief Rodriguez, he said, the title awkward in his mouth like he was learning a foreign language. I wanted to apologize for what I said. I didn't understand. Katie cut him off with a small shake of her head. You didn't say anything I haven't heard before, she said quietly. Just remember it the next time you think you know someone's story based on their title. She walked away and the resident stood there, processing what she said, understanding that he had just been educated by someone who had forgotten more about sacrifice than he would ever learn. Emma called from her room, Katie. Come see. She was standing unassisted for the first time, wobbly but upright, gripping the parallel bars with a determination that mirrored her father's military bearing. Colonel Hartwell had tears running down his face. Katie crossed to Emma and steadied her, hands ready to catch but not grabbing, and Emma took 3 shaky steps forward. Power is not a title, Katie said softly, meant for Emma but loud enough that Colonel Hartwell and Dr. Chen in the doorway heard it too. Power is the ability to help. Emma took another step, and through the window the last light caught the engraving on the challenge coin lying on the bedside table, the insignia worn almost smooth, but still visible if you knew what to look for. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your story, subscribe to the Code Whisperers and hit the notification bell. Like this video. And tell us in the comments, have you ever watched someone's entire life change because one person refused to give up on them?